The symbol you call a cross is older than Christianity by 3,000 years. Spinoza found the moment it was taken, and the document that shows what the Church chose not to tell you. I want to be precise about what I mean. Not older in the sense that crosses exist as shapes in many cultures. Not older in the sense that two lines meeting at right angles appear throughout human art. Older in the specific, documented, archaeologically verified sense, the exact combination of loop and vertical bar that became the emblem of Christian faith was a functioning religious symbol in the Nile Valley 3,000 years before anyone was baptized. It was associated with a specific god. It meant a specific thing. It was held in the hands of specific divine figures in temple reliefs carved before Moses was born, and the pathway by which it traveled from those temple walls into the hands of the early church is not a theory. It is a documented historical transition that left its name written in Latin. Before I tell you where it came from, I need to show you what the symbol actually was. Not what you know it as, what it meant before it became the thing on every church steeple and every confirmation bracelet and every funeral wreath in the Western world. Because the origin is not interesting unless you understand what was being carried when the symbol moved. A shape is just geometry. But a shape that carries a meaning attached to a specific cult, a specific theology, a specific understanding of what happens after death, is something else entirely. That is what the Ankh was. And that is what the Church absorbed. Spinoza did not approach religious symbols the way theologians approach them. He did not ask what they mean to the faithful. He asked where they came from, how they function, and what their history reveals about the institutions that deploy them. The Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, published in 1670 when that kind of question was still dangerous enough to require anonymity, is among other things a method, a way of reading the surface of religious practice and tracing it back to the human decisions that produced it. Spinoza was not destroying religion, he was doing archaeology. And when you apply his method to the cross, to the specific shape that defines Christian identity across every denomination and every century, the excavation reveals something that the Church has preferred for 16 centuries to leave buried. The Ankh was already ancient when Egypt was young. The hieroglyph appears in the pre-dynastic period, before the first unified dynasty, which places it at approximately 3,150 years before the Common Era. E.A. Wallace Budge, whose work, The Gods of the Egyptians, remains among the foundational texts of Egyptological scholarship, traced the symbol to the earliest funerary iconography of the Nile Valley. The form is distinctive, a vertical bar, a horizontal bar crossing it, and above the crossing a loop, a closed oval or teardrop shape at the top, where a second crossbar would otherwise be. That loop is what distinguishes the Ankh from a plain cross. It is also what makes the later Christian transformation so verifiable. The loop was gradually removed. You can trace the disappearance of that loop across 3 centuries of Coptic Christian art. It does not vanish suddenly. It shrinks, it flattens, it becomes vestigial, and then it is gone. But before I show you that transition, I need to explain what the Ankh meant in the context it was created, because without that, the transition is just an aesthetic observation. With it, the transition becomes something that Spinoza would have found, and did find through his method, structurally revelatory. The word Ankh in ancient Egyptian means life. It also means mirror. And the overlap between those two meanings is not accidental. It means the breath of life specifically. Budge connects it to the animating force that the gods were believed to carry and to confer. In hieroglyphic writing, the Ankh appears whenever a text speaks of eternal life, of immortality, of what survives death. It was carved onto the entrances of tombs not as decoration but as inscription, the word life, written in the language of symbols, placed at the threshold between the living world and the world below. And the Ankh was carried in the hands of gods. This is important, and I want to stay with it for a moment, because the specific visual grammar of how the Ankh appears in Egyptian religious art is directly relevant to what happens when it moves into Christian iconography. In temple reliefs from the Old Kingdom forward, the gods are depicted holding the Ankh by the loop, as though it were a key, which is precisely how Budge describes it, the key of life, the instrument by which the divine grants the continuation of existence. The gods hold it toward the face of the pharaoh, or toward the face of the deceased, in a gesture that reads as conferral, I give you life. I extend your existence beyond the threshold of death. Which gods? That is the question. And the answer is the foundation of everything that follows. The Ankh appears throughout the Egyptian pantheon. Ra holds it, Hathor holds it, Thoth holds it. But the two figures most consistently associated with the Ankh, in the context of death and resurrection specifically, are Osiris and Isis. Osiris, the god who was murdered and dismembered and reassembled and resurrected. Isis, who gathered his scattered body and restored him to life. Together, they form the foundational myth of Egyptian religion, the narrative around which the entire theology of afterlife was organized. Death is not the end. The body can be reassembled, life can be restored, the soul survives. The Ankh, in this context, is the symbol of that promise. It is not merely an aesthetic marker, it is a theological statement. Life continues. Death is a threshold, not a terminus. And the specific deity who embodies that promise most completely, and who holds the Ankh in his hands in image after image across 3,000 years of Egyptian religious art, is Osiris, the god of resurrection, the god of the dead, the god of eternal life. I want you to hold that description in mind because I'm going to return to it. But first I need to take you somewhere. Some years ago, this would have been in the early 2000s, I would not be more precise than that, I was in the Egyptian wing of a major collection. I will not specify which one, because the particular institution is not the point. The room was long, and the light was that particular museum quality of light that is designed to illuminate without damaging. Cool, slightly directionless, coming from above at an angle that flattens shadows and makes everything look simultaneously closer and more remote than it actually is. The air had the quality that museum air always has in rooms housing ancient stone and linen, dry, faintly dusty, with a low underscent of something that is not quite smell and not quite absence of smell. It is the nearest thing I know to the smell of time. I was standing in front of a sarcophagus, not one of the spectacular gold-leafed royal examples, a working sarcophagus, the kind that held ordinary priests and administrators and educated citizens of the Middle Dynasties. Painted. The paint was still there in the particular faded, vivid way that 3,000-year-old pigment survives. Ochre and black and a blue that had shifted toward gray, but had not quite lost its blueness. And across the surface of the lid, repeated in registers, were the gods. Osiris at the foot in his characteristic posture, wrapped as a mummy, arms crossed, holding the crook and flail. Isis with her wings extended across the lid. Anubis, Thoth, and Osiris again, larger, at the head. In his hand, held by the loop, presented toward the face of whoever was painted on the interior, was the Ankh. I stood there for, I cannot say how long. Long enough that the guard at the far end of the room glanced at me twice. What I was experiencing was not academic recognition. It was something more disorienting than that, because I was not looking at an Egyptian symbol and thinking, that is like the Christian cross. I was looking at the Ankh and seeing it as the cross. The visual system that had been trained across 40 years of church attendance and theological study had done something involuntary and complete. It had superimposed the two symbols as a single object. I was looking at 3,000 years of Osiris worship and seeing the emblem of every Easter service I had ever attended. The disjunction between those two frameworks was not comfortable. It was not the pleasant frisson of an interesting historical connection. It was the sensation of two very large things occupying the same space at the same time, and the space not being quite large enough. I bought a tea from the museum cafe afterward. I sat with it and let it go cold, while I tried to think clearly about what had just rearranged itself in my mind. What I was grappling with was not new information. I had known, in the abstract, the scholarly position on the Coptic adoption of the Ankh. I had known it the way you know many things you have encountered in footnotes and passing references, as a fact that resides in the category of interesting, but peripheral. What the physical object in that room did was refuse to allow the fact to remain peripheral. It promoted the fact to central, because when you stand in front of the object, the connection is not a scholarly argument. It is a visual event. That is what Flinders Petrie meant, I think, when he wrote in The Religion of Ancient Egypt that the Ankh is the most persistent symbol in Egyptian religious history. Petrie was precise about persistence. He did not mean that the symbol survived accidentally, the way a pot survives because it was buried in the right conditions. He meant that it survived actively, that it was repeatedly chosen in each successive theological framework as the symbol adequate to the concept it represented. Through the Old Kingdom, through the Middle Kingdom, through the New Kingdom, through the fragmentation of the Third Intermediate Period, through the Ptolemaic period, when Greek culture had permeated Egyptian religion at every level, the Ankh survived all of it. And the reason it survived, Petrie argued, is that the concept it represented, life, the continuation of existence beyond death, is not a concept that any human culture has been able to do without. That persistence has a specific and remarkable episode that tells you something important about the power of this symbol. The Amarna period. 18 years, approximately 1353 to 1336 before the Common Era, during which the pharaoh Akhenaten abolished the traditional Egyptian pantheon and replaced it with the worship of a single deity, Aten, the solar disk. This was a genuine theological revolution, the first documented monotheism in history, or at least the first imposed state monotheism. Akhenaten closed the temples. He erased the names of the old gods from monuments. He moved the capital to a new city. He reorganized the priesthood. He did what no pharaoh before him had done. He attempted to eliminate the accumulated theology of 3,000 years and replace it with a single, unmediated, aniconic deity. And yet, in the reliefs and carvings from Amarna that have survived, the Ankh is still there. Aten's rays end in human hands, and those hands hold the Ankh. The symbol that had been the instrument of Osiris and Isis, the symbol associated most intimately with the polytheist theology that Akhenaten was attempting to abolish, was retained. Even in the context of the most radical religious reform in Egyptian history, the Ankh could not be relinquished. The concept it represented was too central, too necessary, too woven into the understanding of what divine power means: life, the continuation of existence. Even a monotheist pharaoh could not build a religion without it. That is one of three layers of absorption that Spinoza's method identifies in the archaeology of this symbol. The first is the adoption within Egyptian religion itself, the movement of the Ankh from one theological context to another, from one divine figure to another, while retaining its core meaning. The second is the Hellenistic contamination of the Ptolemaic period, when the symbol's meaning was translated into Greek theological categories without being abandoned. And the third, the one that is almost never discussed in mainstream Christian scholarship, is the Coptic absorption of the 4th century, which is the transition that produced the symbol you now call the cross. Let me take you to that transition, because it is not, as it is sometimes presented, a gradual and organic evolution. It has a name, it left evidence, and the evidence is in the object itself. The Osiris connection deepens when you read the funerary theology of ancient Egypt in its full elaboration. The weighing of the heart is the pivotal ceremony. The soul of the deceased is brought before Osiris in the Hall of Two Truths, and the heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the feather of cosmic truth and justice. If the heart is lighter than the feather, if the life lived was righteous, the soul is admitted to the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. If the heart is heavier, it is consumed, and the soul ceases to exist. Osiris presides over this judgment. He holds the crook and the flail. But in the reliefs depicting the moment of judgment, in the papyri, on the tomb walls, in the illustrated funerary manuscripts, the Ankh is present. It is at the threshold. It is the symbol of what is at stake: life, the continuation of the soul, eternal existence in the presence of the divine. Osiris, who was himself the proof that death could be overcome, holds the instrument of life over the moment of judgment. I was at a conference some years before my visit to that museum. This would have been the early 2000s in the Midlands, one of those Near Eastern studies gatherings that take place in converted university buildings, where the rooms are too warm in the afternoon and too cold in the morning, and the coffee is always in those thin plastic cups that conduct heat so efficiently that you have to hold them by the rim. I had gone to a session on Coptic Christianity and Egyptian continuity, specifically a panel on the visual iconography of the transition from late Ptolemaic to early Coptic religious art. The session was competent, but not revelatory. I came away with some useful references, but nothing I had not largely anticipated. In the corridor afterward, one of those grey wool carpet corridors with notice boards full of overlapping paper, the kind of corridor that exists in every British academic institution built between 1950 and 1980, I fell into conversation with a scholar whose name I'm going to refrain from citing, not because there is anything sensitive about what he said, but because corridor remarks deserve the protection of informality. He was a specialist in late-period Egyptian religion, and we had crossed paths at one or two previous gatherings. He had just come from a different session on Coptic manuscript traditions. I asked him, I was testing the ground, as one does, what he made of the current state of the scholarship on the Ankh to cross transition. He looked at me the way academics look when they are calculating how seriously a question is being asked. And then he said something that I found, and still find, more arresting than most of what I heard at formal presentations. He said, "No serious scholar of 4th century Coptic Christianity denies the visual continuity. The question was never whether it happened. The question was always how you discuss it in a context where the discussion itself is considered improper." He said it the way you say something self-evident, not with drama, not with the air of someone imparting a revelation, the way you say the sun rises in the east, as a matter of record whose contestation would be mildly embarrassing. And then someone called his name from down the corridor, and he excused himself and he was gone. I stood there with the plastic cup of cold tea in my hand. It had gone cold while we were talking, the way institutional tea always does before you can finish it. And I stayed with what he had said. No serious scholar denies it. The question is how you discuss it in a context where the discussion is considered improper. That is the shape of what Spinoza would call suppression by silence, not denial, not refutation, impropriety. The decision that certain well-established facts are not suitable topics for certain audiences. I will come back to that. But first, I need to show you the transition itself, because it is documented in a way that is too precise to be circumstantial. The 4th century of the Common Era is the pivotal period. The Roman Empire was in the process of becoming, officially, a Christian empire. Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 had established religious tolerance. The Council of Nicaea in 325 had begun the process of theological standardization. By the end of the century, under Theodosius, Christianity was the official state religion, and in Egypt, which had been a Christian community since the 1st century, since the early communities of Alexandria, the interface between Egyptian religious tradition and the emerging Christian iconography was producing artifacts that preserve the transition in visible form. Coptic Christians, the Egyptian Christians whose community is among the oldest in the world, adopted the Ankh, not metaphorically, not symbolically in some vague sense. They adopted it as their Christian symbol for eternal life through Christ, and they used it in exactly the context it had always been used, in funerary art, on tomb walls, on grave markers, in the iconographic language of death and resurrection. Margaret Bunsen, in the Encyclopedia of Ancient Egypt, documents this clearly. 4th century Coptic Christians adopted the Ankh as a Christian cross symbol representing eternal life through Christ. The theological content, eternal life, was identical. The symbol was the same. The visual grammar of the Ankh, held, presented, placed at the threshold between death and life, was preserved. And the Roman world gave the transitional form a name, crux ansata, the cross with a handle. That is the Latin term used by scholars, by archaeologists, by the inscriptions themselves, for the Ankh in its transitional Christian form, crux, cross, ansata, with a handle, from the Latin ansa, meaning handle or loop, the loop that distinguishes the Ankh from a plain cross. The Romans, who were, after all, the administrators and record keepers of the ancient world, gave the transitional symbol a name that describes exactly what it is: a cross with the Egyptian loop still attached. And in that name, the entire history of the transition is preserved. Because you only name something the cross with a handle if you are aware that the standard cross does not have one. You only need the adjective if the noun is already established. The crux ansata is the name of the in-between, the moment of conversion, the moment when the loop has not yet been removed, the moment when the two symbols are still visibly occupying the same object. And that is the second micro-reward this material contains, if you have followed it carefully. The Church did not rename the borrowed symbol and erase its origins in a single act. The evidence of the borrowing is preserved in the Latin name the Church's own world gave the transitional form. The crux ansata is the receipt. It is the documentation in the Church's own administrative language that the cross with a handle preceded the cross without one, that the loop existed, that it had to be removed, that removing it was a choice. I am now going to tell you what Spinoza found, and I want to be clear about what I mean when I say that, because Spinoza did not write about the Ankh. The Tractatus Theologico-Politicus does not mention the crux ansata. Spinoza was not an Egyptologist. He was something more fundamental. He was a methodologist. He developed a way of reading religious history that, applied to this transition, produces conclusions that the Church has found and continues to find inconvenient. What Spinoza was doing in the Tractatus was not theology. It was something more disturbing. It was the application of a rigorously naturalist method to the question of how religious authority is constructed and maintained. He was not asking whether religious symbols are true. He was asking how they work. And the answer he arrived at, carefully, in language that almost escaped the censors of the Amsterdam publishing house that produced the book, is that religious symbols work because institutions make them work. And institutions make them work by obscuring the history of how they acquired them. I have been over this ground many times, but I want to tell you about one particular afternoon when the weight of it became most clear to me. It was autumn. In Norfolk, autumn comes in the way it comes to flat eastern landscapes. Not suddenly, but with a gradual thickening of the light, a slow reddening in the early evening, a quality of afternoon air that is cool but not cold, carrying the scent of turned earth from the fields outside the town. I was at my desk in Norwich, the desk I have worked at for 30 years, by the window that faces northeast, with the lamp that I have used so long. Its shade has faded from black to a kind of dark brown gray. The lamp was on, though it was not yet dark. It was the kind of afternoon where you turn the lamp on for character, not for light. I had the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus in front of me, my working copy, which is the one with the penciled annotations that have accumulated across decades. The margins increasingly dense with the residue of different readings in different years, some in ink, some in pencil, some with question marks that I cannot now entirely reconstruct the reasoning behind. Chapter 5, in which Spinoza lays out his argument about the function of ceremonies and symbols in religious life. The argument is typically Spinozist in its precision. Ceremonies and symbols, he argues, are not windows onto divine realities. They are instruments of social cohesion. They bind communities together. They mark boundaries. Who is inside the community and who is outside. They transmit authority from one generation to the next by making the transmission feel like participation in something eternal rather than something historically contingent. The symbol appears to speak of God. In reality, Spinoza argues, it speaks of the community that adopted it and of the specific historical circumstances under which the adoption occurred. I was not, that afternoon, trying to apply this to the Ankh. I was working on something else entirely, the relationship between Spinoza's theory of prophecy and some other material I was arranging. But the logic of Chapter 5 kept extending itself, in the way Spinoza's logic tends to. It found its own application. The Ankh and the crux ansata were sitting at the edge of my attention, material I had been working with intermittently for some months. And at some point in the afternoon, I cannot say exactly when, because this is the way that quiet intellectual moments happen. They do not announce themselves, the application locked into place. If the function of a religious symbol is social cohesion, not divine revelation, then the adoption of the Ankh by Coptic Christians is not a contamination of Christian symbolism by Egyptian paganism. It is the mechanism working exactly as Spinoza describes. A community under specific historical circumstances, the Coptic Christians of 4th century Egypt, operating in a cultural context saturated with the Ankh's meaning of eternal life, adopted the available symbol that best expressed the central promise of their faith. They did not adopt it despite its pagan associations. They adopted it because its associations, death, resurrection, eternal life, divine conferral of continued existence, were precisely the associations they needed. The symbol was not empty, it was full, and it was full of exactly the right thing. I looked up at some point, and the afternoon light outside the northeast window had gone. The lamp was doing actual work now rather than decorative work. The tea I had made when I sat down was cold on the desk, untouched. I had not noticed either of those things happening. That is the particular quality of this kind of thinking. Not exciting, not dramatic, but absorbing in the literal sense, the sense of taking everything else into itself, so that when you surface, you find that time has moved without you. And then gradually the loop was removed. The crux ansata became the cross. And the history that the loop had made visible, the history of Osiris and Isis, of the Nile Valley, of 3,000 years of resurrection theology before Christ, was made invisible with it. There is a question that the Church has never answered directly. I have been reading theological literature for more than 40 years, academic theology, pastoral theology, liturgical history, patristics, iconography, church history. I have read mainstream Protestant sources, mainstream Catholic sources, Orthodox sources. I have attended conferences where these questions were adjacent to the discussion. I have read footnotes in footnotes. And in all of that reading, I have not found in mainstream Christian theological scholarship, not heterodox scholarship, not secular scholarship, mainstream Christian theological scholarship, a direct, sustained, honest treatment of what the crux ansata means for the uniqueness of the cross as a Christian symbol. That absence is itself a document. Spinoza would have recognized it immediately. He called the mechanism suppression by silence, not denial. Denial requires engagement. Denial requires a counter-argument. Suppression by silence requires only the decision that a subject is not suitable for treatment. You do not refute it. You do not forbid it. You simply do not discuss it. You make it through the accumulated weight of editorial decision across centuries of theological publishing, unavailable as a topic. The subject exists in the scholarly literature. Every serious Egyptologist knows the crux ansata. Every serious scholar of Coptic Christianity knows the 4th century adoption. The specialist corridor, as my colleague demonstrated with his cup of cold tea, knows perfectly well what the evidence shows, but the corridor does not become the pulpit. The footnote does not become the sermon. The specialist's self-evident fact does not become the congregation's available knowledge. Why? Here is where Spinoza's method arrives at its most unsettling conclusion, and I want to stay with the question for a moment before I answer it, because the answer changes things in a way that is difficult to walk back from. If you see the pattern once, if you understand the mechanism by which a symbol is absorbed, adapted, stripped of its history, and presented as originary, you will begin to see it elsewhere. I am not saying this to be dramatic. I am saying it as a practical warning about what happens to the mind once Spinoza's method has been applied to a single case and found to be accurate. The pattern does not stay where you first found it. If the cross is sacred because God instituted it, its history is irrelevant. It was placed by divine act at the center of Christian identity, and the fact that a similar shape appeared in Egyptian temples 3,000 years earlier is an interesting coincidence and nothing more. But if the cross is sacred because the Christian community adopted it and treats it as sacred, if its power is social power, as Spinoza argues, then its history is everything. Then the question of where it came from and what meanings it carried when it arrived is not a distraction from theology. It is theology. It is the question of how religious meaning is actually made, not by divine fiat, but by human communities, borrowing, absorbing, adapting, and above all obscuring the borrowing, so that the borrowed thing appears to have always belonged to you. That obscuring is what the suppression by silence achieves. It is not dishonesty in the simple sense. It is the institutional management of history in the service of identity. The loop is removed from the crux ansata, and with the loop, the 3,000 years of Osiris worship that the loop made visible. What remains is a cross, clean, universal, apparently without history. The emblem of a specific divine event, the crucifixion, with no prior life, no cultural residue, no inherited meaning from the religion it displaced, except that it does have a prior life. It has 3,000 years of prior life in the hands of gods who were promising resurrection to the dead before any Christian theology existed. And the meaning it carried when the Coptic Christians adopted it, eternal life, death overcome, the divine conferral of continued existence, is not a different meaning from the Christian meaning. It is the same meaning. That is not a similarity, that is an identity. John Dominic Crossan in The Historical Jesus documented the degree to which first-century Palestinian Christianity was permeated with Egyptian symbolism and Alexandrian theological frameworks. Crossan's argument is that you cannot understand the early Christian movement without understanding the Mediterranean cultural matrix in which it developed, and that matrix was saturated with Egyptian religious content. The trade routes between Palestine and Egypt, the Jewish communities of Alexandria, the Hellenistic synthesis that had been blending Greek, Egyptian, and Near Eastern religious thought for 3 centuries before Christ. All of this created a world in which the Osiris narrative, the Ankh, the theology of death and resurrection were not exotic imports, but part of the shared religious vocabulary of the region. The first Christians were not encountering a foreign symbol when they encountered the Ankh. They were encountering the most powerful available expression of the thing they most wanted to say. And once you see that, the pattern begins to appear in other places. Not just in the cross, in the theology of sacrifice, in the imagery of resurrection, in the narrative of a God who dies and rises, and whose death and resurrection are the basis of a promise of eternal life to those who worship him. The Osiris parallel is not a vague structural resemblance. It is specific. Osiris was murdered, betrayed by a member of his own family, killed at a gathering. He was dismembered and scattered. He was reassembled and restored to life. His resurrection became the proof and the promise. Death is not permanent. The soul that is judged righteous will continue. The life that was interrupted will be resumed. The church that used the Ankh-derived cross as its central symbol was the church whose central promise was structurally identical to the promise that the Ankh had represented for 3,000 years before it. This is not coincidence. It is the reason the symbol worked. The Coptic Christians who adopted the crux ansata were not being theologically careless. They were being theologically precise. The symbol fit because the theology fit, and the theology fit because the human needed addressed. The refusal to accept that the people we love and that we ourselves simply stop is not a Christian need. It is a human need. It was being addressed in the Nile Valley 3,000 years before the Gospels were written. Spinoza understood this not as a critique, but as a clarification. Religions that survive are religions that can absorb. They take the symbols and narratives that already carry meaning for the people they are speaking to, and they adapt those symbols and narratives to carry the new theological content. This is not theft in the usual sense. It is translation. It is the process by which a new religious community makes itself legible to its cultural environment. The Coptic Christians did not steal the Ankh. They recognized it, they saw in it the shape of their own faith's central claim, and they adopted it. But there is a secondary move that Spinoza identifies, and this is the move that distinguishes honest translation from institutional management. The secondary move is the erasure of the translation history. After the absorption, the institution presents the resulting symbol as originary, as if it had always meant what it means now, as if it had been received directly from the divine source without any prior human history. This is what the removal of the loop from the crux ansata achieves. It is the act of erasure. And it is this act, and not the absorption itself, that Spinoza finds troubling, because erasure is a form of institutional insecurity. You only need to erase the history if the history is a threat. And the history is a threat only if the authority of the symbol depends on its appearing to be unique, uncontaminated, purely and originally Christian. If the cross derived its authority from its theological meaning, if the promise of resurrection is true, regardless of whether Osiris also promised resurrection, then the Egyptian history is not a threat. It is an enrichment. It is the record of a human hunger for the same promise across 3,000 years and multiple religious frameworks. It suggests not that Christianity borrowed something that diminishes it, but that the hope Christianity expresses is ancient enough to have survived in many forms in many cultures before it arrived at its present form. That is, in fact, how I think Spinoza would have understood it. Not as a debunking, not as evidence that the Christian promise is false because it is old. Spinoza was not trying to take the symbol away from anyone. He was trying to return it to what it actually is, a human creation, carrying a human hope, with a history that stretches back to the earliest attempts of human beings to say that death is not the end. Spinoza did not want you to stop using the cross. He wanted you to know where it came from. That is a different thing. Knowing where a symbol came from does not diminish it. It places it. It shows you the full depth of the human need that produced it, the length of the human tradition that carried it, the number of different peoples and different theologies that looked at the same shape and found in it the same promise. That is not a lesser thing. That is a greater one. The cross did not originate on Calvary. The promise of resurrection did not originate with the empty tomb. Both have histories that reach back through Coptic Egypt, through the Ptolemaic synthesis, through the Osiris cult of the Nile Delta, to a painted sarcophagus in a room with cool directionless light and dry air, where a god with arms folded and a loop in his hand was promising a specific dead person that the heart is lighter than the feather of truth, and that the journey continues. The symbol survived because the hope survived. The hope survived because it is necessary, not because one religion is true and all the others were approximations. Because the human experience of loss and the human refusal to accept that loss is final is not contingent on any particular theological system. It pre-exists all theological systems. It will outlast all theological systems. What Spinoza understood, working alone in the Amsterdam of the 1670s, is that the history of a symbol is not the enemy of its meaning. It is the evidence of its necessity. The Ankh did not become less meaningful when it became the cross. The cross is not diminished by its 3,000-year history, but both are diminished by the silence about that history. Because the silence says, this symbol cannot bear its own origins. This faith is too fragile to survive the knowledge of what it absorbed. And Spinoza, who believed that the truth fully understood is more sustaining than any comfortable obscurity, would have found that institutional judgment both incorrect and unnecessary. I have sat with this for a long time, in that study in Norwich with the lamp that has faded from black to gray-brown, and the window that faces northeast, and the desk that has held 40 years of this work. And what I have arrived at is not cynicism. It is something more like an enlarged respect. The cross carries 3,000 years of human hope. Not one faith's hope. The hope of everyone who has ever stood at a threshold and refused to believe that the passage is one way. That is not a lesser inheritance, that is a greater one. If you have stayed with this until now, you know what to write in the comments. Take care of yourselves.
What I shared today, it took me years to accept. Tell me in the comments if this changed something for you. Sometimes the truth is uncomfortable, but it's still the truth.